Welcome to Brewing Today, sponsored by the Beer Loons. Make sure to check out beerloons.com for all sorts of great gifts for the holiday season. Hi, everyone. I am your host, Mike Campbell, and welcome to Brewing Today. Sit back, crack open a beer, and let's chat a little bit about home brewing. On today's show, we're going to talk about Yeast Nutrient and why would I want to use it? When do I want to use it? And if, do I want to use it at all? Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Go to beerloons.com for the 1.5 million ways to stay in touch with us. We are the social networking giants of home brewing and craft beer. All sorts of wonderful stuff on there. So that's beerloons.com. So let's start off first and foremost with what is yeast nutrient. And basically, yeast nutrient is made up of well, nutrient, simply put. And the reason why I'm kind of laughing a little bit is even though I'm trying to make this a professional show, some days it just doesn't go that way because we have a lovely little female kitty that's a little bit over 3 months old by the name of Barley that we adopted a little bit less than a week ago. In fact, it'll be a week ago tonight. And she is with me here as I do this show, and as any kitten is, getting into trouble. She keeps stepping on my tablet, so I don't have my script in front of me anymore. And yes, believe it or not, I do script the show. But anyway, back to what yeast nutrient is. First and foremost, it's vitamins. It's minerals, it's inorganic nitrogen, organic nitrogen, zinc, phosphates, and trace minerals. Okay, so that's good. It's basically a food and vitamin source for the yeast. So why would you want to use yeast nutrient? Well, as far as it goes, yeast nutrient's great if you have a slow starting yeast or the fermentation just doesn't seem to be going very well. Now, keep in mind, the cooler in temperature you go, the slower the fermentation process is going to go. So even if it's slower, especially in the winter months, the fermentations tend to be slower if you ferment in your basement or in a cool area. So just because the fermentation's slow doesn't mean you necessarily have to use yeast nutrient, but it's certainly not going to hurt anything. One of the main reasons people use yeast nutrient is because of yeast propagation, or if they're making a yeast starter, you're trying to get the yeast to grow big and strong and multiply and do all sorts of wonderful things. So when you add it into the wort, it starts quickly and does a nice long fermentation and has a good attenuation. Stress yeast, it's a good idea to use yeast nutrient as well. So if you're in an area that is consistently a very hot area like Florida or Texas, an area where maybe your yeast is being shipped into a lot, great idea to use yeast nutrient. Or on the flip side, now in the cold weather of Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Midwest, lots of areas where the temperatures are cool, yeast nutrient can help revive the yeast as well, so it does as it's supposed to. This is particularly helpful if you're shipping the yeast. The other thing yeast nutrient does for you is it gives you a consistent attenuation rate. So it helps the yeast do what it's supposed to as well as it can on a consistent basis. So when do I want to use it? Well, if you suspect there's any problems with the fermentation itself, so again, slow fermentation, no fermentation, sometimes it can help. High alcohol beers is a very good reason to use yeast nutrient as well as do a yeast starter. The higher you go in alcohol, the harder it is for the yeast to get to that alcohol point, because alcohol will eventually kill the yeast off. It depends on the strain of yeast on how high that alcohol is, but most beer yeast might be around 9% or so. Others could be a little higher, some can be a little bit lower. So if you're doing, let's say, a barley wine where you are trying to get up there to the 8, 9, 10% range with a standard beer yeast, you're going to want to do as much as you can for that yeast as possible. Make a big yeast starter, a couple liters at least, and use Yeast Nutrient just to make sure you get as much active yeast as you possibly can in that beer so it finishes where it's supposed to. You add Yeast Nutrient. If you're doing the yeast starter, you would add it during the boil of the yeast starter. If you're not going to do a yeast starter and just add it to the wort itself, go ahead the last 10 to 15 minutes of the boil. And this information really comes from Yeast Labs, who makes a brewing yeast nutrient. So, which is nice because in the past there really wasn't anything specific to beer brewing. Although if you have yeast nutrient, you're a winemaker, and you have some yeast nutrient, it's okay to go ahead and use that. It certainly works. But if you're really just a brewer and you want to make the best beer that you can, then the yeast nutrient is a way to go because it is meant for beer itself. All right. Do you use it at all? Do you want to really use this? Yes, if you want the beer to turn out the best that you can. There's a lot of things that we try to work on to make the best beers that we can, and this is just another way to do it. Paying attention to temperature, like you've heard me talk in previous episodes on the post-show. Temperature is important. Fermentation temperature, brewing temperature, mash temperature, sparge temperature, all that fun stuff, depending on the form of brewing that you do. Pay attention to temperatures. Again, going into the cooler months, temperatures are cooler. Yeast will slow down. That's okay, and that's fine as long as it's not too cold. You don't want ale yeast going, in the low 60s or below that because it doesn't perform very well. Yeast nutrient's not necessarily going to save you if you're too cold a temperature. It can help, but it's not necessarily going to do that much more for the yeast. But if you're in an area where maybe it's 64, 66 degrees, yeast nutrient can certainly help get the full attenuation of the yeast and make it do as much as it needs to do. Now, and you can use it for any type of beer that you make, whether it's lower gravity, normal gravity, high gravity, whatever. It's one of those things that's not going to hurt the beer in any form or fashion. However, I do say this, you don't have to use it on your regular old beers. So you're making a 5% red ale, and you're using Irish ale yeast or American ale yeast, whatever. It doesn't really matter. Those will handle that alcohol just fine. The attenuation will be just fine for the most part, unless you're in a really hot or really cold area where the temperature is more of an issue than anything. And yeast nutrient's not going to do much more for you. So, do you have to use it in every batch? No, you don't. And it's a good idea if you just want to stay as consistent as possible. It's a good idea if you're pushing the limits of the yeast and all that, but it's not something that you necessarily have to do every batch. I don't use it every batch. I'm just starting to get into using it again and seeing if there's a big difference. It's been many, many years since I've used it, and I'm kind of going back and making sure things, if it goes better, great, I'll pass that information on. If it's about the same, I'll pass that information on as well. Just like I started going back and doing yeast starters just to see what would happen, see if it improves the end result or the flavor of the beer. So that's it about yeast nutrients. So that's going to do it for our show today. And don't forget about our craft beer reviews on the Beer Brew For You show. Now shortened to about 5 minutes or less. I've been averaging about 5.5 minutes. I still can't get under 5 minutes for some reason. You think that'd be plenty of time, but it's not. Anyway, thank you so much for spending time with us this week. And until next time, cheers.